I'll just touch on, because I've been having a lot of conversations about it lately. One of the more cliched and common discussions around God, at least the Christian God. You'll hear people often say, like, why does God allow bad things to happen? Why does God allow that person to shoot up a school, or that person to beat their kids, or that woman to get raped, or, pick the horrific thing? Why would God allow that? And it's interesting, because as I've been doing the podcast and having conversations, I've had the chance to have that type of conversation with a lot of really thoughtful, well-versed Christians. And it's interesting when you start to kind of parse out how people work through that. And you've seen it throughout the history of time, like through the Catholic Church and Christianity, like St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas. Like there's these different people who've been trying to make sense of this. Like it's almost like they've been given this answer at the beginning, which is that God is great, God is all-powerful, God is beautiful, everything good is from God. But then they have this information they need to reconcile with that, of the actual world and the horrible things they see. And the issue I keep running into is that there's kind of two common responses to it. One is perhaps the most common one, which is that, God has a plan. We can't understand God's plan. We can't understand why suffering would exist, what it's going to lead to, how it might be better for us in some long run. We can't understand that. So to judge God in some ways because he, she, it allows suffering is so naive, so ignorant, so arrogant, to assume that suffering isn't justified, to assume that God doesn't know what they're doing with this plan. And the most common thing I say to that, which could be a whole nother video discussion in and of itself, is I could buy that. But it's hard to imagine if you think of some of that horrific suffering. If you think about whatever form that comes in for you, right? Think about a child, maybe your child, going through something horrific. It's hard for me to comprehend, to accept the idea that I should be okay with that. That's like, there's a greater good that justifies that suffering. That, in very simple terms, what you're asking me to say is like, oh, I see that kid going through horrific suffering I couldn't even imagine. And not the type that's going to make them stronger, right? That very likely could end in them just dying and not being here anymore. It doesn't matter what's on the other side of that. That kid might be in heaven, living a great life. Maybe somehow it's going to lead to some sort of utopia for us, or something that we can't even comprehend. But I still know that suffering. And if that's what it's going to take to get there, it's very hard for me to accept that. And furthermore, it's hard for me to imagine that if there is a God in the way that Christians speak about God, that if I was to be upset, if I was to refuse to accept the idea of being okay with that child suffering, somehow I'm being disrespectful to God. Somehow I'm being ungodly. It's almost impossible for me to imagine that dynamic is at play. That me caring about that kid suffering and not wanting them to have to go through it goes against God. It's hard for me to process that. I recognize it's possibly true, but I always come back to this idea that if God did have a decision in it, and it was, hey, there's this great, amazing thing we're going to get to, but there's got to be some suffering along the way. It's just the way it's got to be. It's hard for me to not say, we shouldn't have done it then. If that was your choice, right? That kid and countless other kids and countless other people are going to have to suffer for an unimaginable amount of time to get to that thing, well, then just don't do it. The thing's not worth it. Turn it off. Just turn it off. Don't do any of it. If that's the only way it can happen, then it shouldn't happen. Like, why would you set it up in a way in which that happens? And then that leads to the second common refrain, right? Which is, well, God doesn't create the suffering. Man does, right? God created man, but God gave man free will and allowed man to choose. But you could pick at that. You can start to press on that and say, all right, well, let's understand that. So God is all-powerful. God created everything. Well, then why did God give free will? And usually the response is something like, well, it had to be that way. For us to get to that good thing, free will had to be it. We had to make our own choice. He, she, it just couldn't give it to us. Couldn't just snap their fingers and make it so. we had to go through this trial. We had to go through this process and this journey and be tested and make the right choices, and then we get to it. Possibly. But what's implied, what's baked into that, is that God does not control everything. Because you can come back to it and say, well, why didn't God just snap his fingers? If the goal is to get to that amazing place, snap your fingers and put us there. And if you say, well, I can't, we have to go through this, well, then that kind of implies that you answer to somebody else. There's something beyond. You have to play by these rules, this framework, which says this is the process it has to follow. And if that's the case, well, then I'd like to speak to the person that's actually in charge. Because if you're just playing by some other rule set, who designed that rule set? Who said it had to be done this way? And if you said it had to be done this way, I go back to my first question. Why would you create a game or a system or a situation or a dynamic where the rule set is such that to get to the good thing, we have to go through so much horribleness? Why would you do that? Just don't do it. Just turn it off. Because a lot of people would say, like, but I have a son, right? Turn it off. Turn it off means you don't get to spend time with your son. You don't get those beautiful, amazing, loving moments of where you're playing with your son in your backyard, or you're just seeing him grow up and seeing him be happy. And listen, those things, among countless other things, are amazing, beautiful, amazing things. But out of love for my son, if the choice is to have those amazing things, but somebody else's son or daughter or what have you is going to suffer a horrific fate, out of love for my son and that person's son, I would say turn it off. I'd say, as much as I love spending time with my son and all those beautiful moments, I would have to say I would give those up if it means some other child and their parents don't have to suffer. That seems like the only godly, loving thing to do. I struggle to reconcile that. It's not that I necessarily think with any certainty that the Christian God isn't real or is evil or doesn't know what they're doing or doesn't have a plan. Maybe they do. Maybe they do. But I just can't understand a world or a universe where the right way to live is for me to try and be as tolerant and indifferent to human suffering as I can be. I can't imagine wanting to live in a world where living a good life means seeing horrific human suffering and being like, if I'm being honest, it's okay. It's going to be fine long term. Like, there's going to be something so amazing, like they're fine. Everybody's fine. A child just being destroyed by cancer. Just families being torn apart by horrific acts. The Holocaust, slavery. I mean, pick the thing. Why would I want to, how can I accept living in a world where I'm meant to say, yeah, that's bad, but don't worry. It's all going to be good. It's no big deal. I can't fathom that. I can't fathom that being the God that I hear of wanting me to take that approach.